The auction block stood silent in the castle courtyard, its wooden surface stained dark with years of rain and tears. Judith Rogers clutched her swollen belly as she watched the crowd disperse, their cruel laughter still echoing off the stone walls. The man she had just purchased lay crumpled at her feet, his once proud armor now dented and bloodied, his face bearing the marks of countless battles and recent humiliation. Ralph Jackson, the fallen knight, raised his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of confusion and broken pride. She had spent her last silver coins to buy him, this stranger who shared nothing with her except the bitter taste of abandonment. The kingdom's nobles had gathered to witness his disgrace, but none could have predicted what would unfold in the days to come. A story that would spread from village to village until even the king himself would weep at its telling. 3 months earlier, Judith had stood in the same courtyard under vastly different circumstances. The autumn leaves danced around her feet as she waited for her husband to return from the northern campaign. Her hand rested protectively over the small life growing within her, and hope filled her heart like warm honey. The other wives gathered near the well, their voices bright with anticipation as they discussed their husband's expected homecoming. Martha Wright, the blacksmith's wife, shared news from the latest messenger, speaking of victories and honor. Donna Young nodded eagerly, her own pregnancy showing just enough to draw knowing smiles from the older women. The war had dragged on for nearly 2 years, but word had come that peace negotiations were underway. Judith remembered how her heart had soared when she saw the riders approaching the castle gates. Banners flew high, and the sound of hoofbeats thundered against the cobblestones like music. She pressed forward with the other women, scanning the faces of the returning soldiers for her beloved Nicholas. The men looked weary but victorious, their armor catching the late afternoon sun. Captain Ethan Roberts rode at the front, his expression grave despite the apparent success of their mission. Behind him came the wounded, supported by their brothers in arms, and Judith's stomach tightened with each face that was not her husband's. When Captain Roberts dismounted and approached the gathered wives, silence fell like a heavy curtain. His weathered face bore the weight of terrible news, and Judith felt the world tilt beneath her feet before he even spoke. Nicholas Alvarez had fallen in the final battle, he explained, his voice barely above a whisper. He had died bravely, saving his comrades from an ambush, but he would not be coming home. The words hit Judith like physical blows, each syllable driving the breath from her lungs. Around her, other women received similar news, their cries of anguish mixing with her own, until the courtyard filled with the sound of hearts breaking. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of grief and practical concerns. Judith found herself alone in the small cottage she had shared with Nicholas, surrounded by his belongings, but unable to feel his presence. The baby moved restlessly within her, as if sensing her distress, and she placed both hands on her belly, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Without Nicholas's soldier's pay, she had no means of support. The cottage belonged to the Lord's estate, and she knew it would not be long before she was asked to leave. Other widows had already departed, returning to their families or seeking work in distant towns. But Judith had no family to claim her, no skills beyond keeping house and tending a garden. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a harshness that seemed to mirror the kingdom's mood. The peace negotiations had failed, and preparations for renewed warfare cast a shadow over every household. Judith's pregnancy progressed, but her resources dwindled with each passing week. She sold Nicholas's personal effects one by one, each transaction feeling like a betrayal of his memory. His sword brought enough silver to last through the coldest months, but she knew it would not be enough to see her through childbirth and beyond. The other villagers looked upon her with pity, but pity did not put food on the table or wood in the fireplace. It was during this desperate time that she first heard of Ralph Jackson. The name was whispered in taverns and market squares, always accompanied by shaking heads and expressions of disgust. He had been a knight of some renown, they said, trusted by lords and feared by enemies. But something had gone wrong during the failed peace talks. Accusations of cowardice flew like arrows, though none could say exactly what had happened. Some claimed he had fled from battle, others that he had betrayed his own men. The stories varied, but the outcome remained the same. Ralph Jackson had been stripped of his lands, his title, and his honor. Now he languished in the castle dungeons, awaiting whatever fate his former peers deemed appropriate. Judith might never have given the disgraced knight another thought, if not for the conversation she overheard while selling her last valuable possession, Nicholas's ceremonial dagger. The weapon dealer, Carl Williams, was discussing the upcoming auction with another merchant, their voices carrying clearly in the crisp winter air. Lord Ethan Roberts had decided to sell Ralph Jackson's remaining possessions, they said, and the man himself would be included in the lot. It was an unusual punishment, more humiliating than execution, designed to strip away the last vestiges of his dignity. The buyer would own his service for a period of 7 years, after which he would be free to leave the kingdom or remain as a common laborer. The idea struck Judith with unexpected force. 7 years of service meant 7 years of labor, and labor meant tasks that needed doing. Her cottage required repairs that she could not afford. Her small garden needed expansion if she hoped to grow enough food to survive. And when the baby came, she would need help with the countless demands of daily life. A disgraced knight might not command the respect he once held, but his hands would still be strong, his back still capable of work. More importantly, the price for such a broken man would likely be low, perhaps within reach of her meager savings. She spent the next week considering the possibility from every angle. The practical benefits were clear, but the social implications gave her pause. What would the other villagers think of a pregnant widow purchasing a man's service? How would such an arrangement appear to those already inclined to gossip about her circumstances? Yet as her belly grew heavier and her strength waned, practical concerns outweighed social ones. She needed help, and Ralph Jackson needed a chance at redemption, even if neither of them realized it yet. The morning of the auction dawned gray and cold, with frost covering the cobblestones like scattered diamonds. Judith wrapped herself in her warmest cloak and made her way to the castle courtyard, where a small crowd had already gathered. The atmosphere was festive in a cruel way, with nobles and merchants treating the event as entertainment rather than the destruction of a man's life. She recognized many faces from happier occasions, people who had once smiled at her when she stood proudly beside Nicholas at court functions. Now their eyes slid past her as if she had become invisible, another casualty of war and misfortune. Ralph Jackson was brought out in chains, his once magnificent armor tarnished and dented from his imprisonment. He walked with his head held high despite his circumstances, and Judith found herself studying his face for signs of the character that lay beneath the accusations. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair and eyes that held more pain than anger. Whatever had happened to earn him this fate, she could see that it had cost him dearly. The crowd jeered as he was led to the auction block, but he gave no sign that their taunts affected him. The auctioneer, Jason Morris, began the proceedings with evident distaste for his task. Ralph Jackson's remaining possessions were sold first, each item bringing modest sums from buyers more interested in novelty than value. His horse went to a merchant's son, his books to a scholar from a neighboring province, his family ring to a collector of curiosities. With each sale, Judith watched the knight's expression grow more distant, as if he were retreating into some inner fortress where their cruelty could not reach him. When the moment came to auction, the man himself, the bidding started lower than Judith had dared hope. The novelty of owning a disgraced knight appealed to some, but the practical reality of feeding and housing him for 7 years discouraged serious offers. A few nobles made half-hearted bids, more for the amusement of their companions than from genuine interest. A wealthy merchant raised the price briefly before losing interest and turning away. Judith waited until the bidding stalled, then raised her hand with a voice that carried clearly across the courtyard. Her offer was modest but sincere, representing nearly every coin she possessed. The crowd turned to stare at her with expressions ranging from surprise to scandal. A pregnant widow bidding on a man's service was unprecedented, and the whispers began immediately. She ignored them, keeping her eyes fixed on the auctioneer as he called for higher bids. When none came, he seemed reluctant to accept her offer, glancing toward the nobles as if hoping for intervention. But business was business, and her silver was as good as anyone else's. The hammer fell with a sound like thunder, and Ralph Jackson belonged to her. The walk back to her cottage was the longest of Judith's life. Ralph Jackson walked beside her in silence, his chains removed but his dignity still in tatters. The villagers they passed stared openly, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. She could hear the whispers starting already, speculation about her motives and his intentions. By evening, the story would be in every household, growing more scandalous with each telling. But she had made her choice, and there was no turning back now. Her cottage sat at the edge of the village, small and weathered, but still sound in its bones. The garden plot beside it lay dormant under winter's grip, and the roof showed signs of damage from the recent storms. It was not much to offer a man who had once owned estates and commanded respect, but it was all she had. She opened the door and gestured for him to enter, suddenly aware of how humble her home must appear to eyes accustomed to castle halls and fine furnishings. Ralph Jackson stepped inside and stood quietly while she lit the fire and prepared a simple meal. He had not spoken since leaving the auction block, and she began to wonder if the ordeal had broken something essential in his spirit. When she finally placed food before him, he ate mechanically, as if the act of nourishment was merely another duty to be endured. Only when she sat across from him with her own plate did he finally raise his eyes to meet hers. "Wait donc?" he asked, his voice hoarse from disuse and humiliation. The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Judith considered her answer carefully, knowing that her words would set the tone for everything that followed. She could speak of practical needs and mutual benefit, of the arrangement as nothing more than a business transaction. But something in his eyes, a flicker of the man he had been beneath the ruins of what he had become, made her choose honesty instead. "Because we both need a chance to survive," she said simply. He studied her face for a long moment, perhaps searching for signs of pity or condescension. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded once and returned to his meal. They finished eating in comfortable silence, the fire crackling softly between them like a promise of warmth in the cold months ahead. That first night, Judith offered him the small room that had served as Nicholas's study, hastily cleared of her husband's papers and personal effects. Ralph Jackson accepted without comment, though she noticed his eyes linger on the empty shelves where books had once stood. She had sold those volumes weeks ago, along with everything else of value, but their absence seemed to speak to him of loss and necessity. When she wished him good night and retreated to her own chamber, she heard him moving quietly about the small space, settling in as best he could manage. The baby chose that night to remind her of its presence with particularly strong movements, as if responding to the day's upheavals. Judith placed her hands on her belly and whispered to the child about the strange turn their lives had taken. She had bought a night service, but what she had really purchased was hope, the possibility that she might not have to face the challenges ahead alone. Whether that hope would prove justified remained to be seen, but for the first time in months, she fell asleep without tears on her cheeks. Morning brought new awkwardness as they navigated the routines of shared living. Ralph Jackson was already awake when she rose, sitting by the window and watching the sunrise with an expression she could not read. He had somehow managed to clean and mend his clothes during the night, though they remained the simple garments of a prisoner rather than the fine attire of his former station. When she began preparing a breakfast dish, he stood and asked quietly what tasks she needed him to perform. The question was both practical and profound, marking the beginning of their working relationship while acknowledging the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Judith looked around her small home with new eyes, seeing it as he might, noting the repairs that needed attention and the improvements that strong hands could accomplish. The roof leaked in two places, the garden fence had gaps that let in hungry rabbits, and the woodshed needed rebuilding before the next storm season. There was work enough for many months, tasks that would benefit them both while giving him purpose beyond mere survival. They established routines quickly, finding a rhythm that suited both their needs and their circumstances. Ralph Jackson proved to be a skilled craftsman as well as a former warrior, his hands as capable with hammer and saw as they had once been with sword and shield. He worked steadily, but without the enthusiasm he might once have shown, performing each task with mechanical precision. Judith watched him repair her roof and mend her fences, noting how he threw himself into physical labor as if trying to exhaust something inside himself that words could not touch. The villagers' reactions to their arrangement varied widely. Some expressed outright disapproval, muttering about the impropriety of a pregnant woman living alone with a disgraced knight. Others showed curiosity tinged with envy, particularly those struggling with their own repairs and maintenance. A few offered cautious support, understanding the practical necessities that drove desperate choices. Martha Wright stopped by one afternoon while Ralph Jackson was working in the garden, her eyes taking in the improvements he had already accomplished. "He works hard," she observed, watching him clear stones from what would become an expanded vegetable plot. "Yes," Judith agreed, her hand resting on her growing belly. "He does." "The talk in the village is not all kind," Martha continued gently. "Some say it's not proper, a woman in your condition with a man like him." Judith met her friend's concerned gaze steadily. "A man like what? One who needs a chance to rebuild his life? One whose hands can fix what mine cannot?" Martha nodded slowly, perhaps hearing the determination in Judith's voice. "You're stronger than they give you credit for. Nicholas would be proud." The mention of her husband's name brought the familiar pang of loss, but it no longer threatened to overwhelm her. Nicholas would indeed have understood the practical necessities that guided her choices, just as he would have appreciated Ralph Jackson's quiet dignity in the face of disgrace. She found herself wondering what her husband would have thought of the man now working so diligently to improve their small homestead, whether he would have seen past the accusations to the character beneath. As winter deepened, their conversations gradually expanded beyond the purely practical. Ralph Jackson began sharing small observations about the work he was doing, suggesting improvements that would benefit the property long term. Judith found herself asking his opinion on various matters, appreciating his thoughtful responses and the knowledge he brought from his former life. Neither of them spoke directly about their pasts, but understanding grew between them like a plant taking root in fertile soil. The baby's movements became more pronounced as her pregnancy progressed, and Judith noticed Ralph Jackson's eyes following her movements with something approaching concern. One evening, as she struggled to reach a high shelf, he quietly stepped forward to assist her, his manner respectful but attentive. It was a small gesture, but it marked a shift in their relationship from mere coexistence to something approaching genuine care. "When is the child expected?" he asked one night, as they sat by the fire, the first personal question he had posed since arriving. "Early spring," she replied, surprised by how natural the conversation felt. "A few months yet." He nodded thoughtfully, his eyes distant. "You'll need help when the time comes. Have you made arrangements?" The question touched on one of her deepest worries. The village had a midwife, but Heather Lopez was elderly and not always reliable. Other women might assist, but Judith's unconventional living situation had strained some relationships. She had been trying not to think too far ahead, focusing instead on getting through each day. "I'm not certain," she admitted. "Things have become complicated." Ralph Jackson studied her face in the firelight, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I've seen battlefield injuries," he said finally. "I know something of emergency care. If needed, I could help." The offer hung between them, intimate and practical at the same time. Judith felt tears prick her eyes at this unexpected kindness from a man who owed her nothing beyond the labor specified in their arrangement. Here was someone offering to stand with her during one of life's most vulnerable moments, asking nothing in return but the chance to be useful. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal that seemed to touch everything around their small homestead. The repairs Ralph Jackson had made through the winter months proved their worth as the rains came and went without flooding the cottage or damaging the expanded garden. He had worked tirelessly to prepare new plots for planting, his knowledge of agriculture proving as valuable as his skill with tools. Judith watched him work with growing appreciation, noting how he planned each task with an eye toward long-term benefit rather than mere immediate necessity. The baby was due any day now, and Judith found herself moving more slowly, her body preparing for the ordeal ahead. Ralph Jackson had become increasingly attentive without being intrusive, ensuring that water was always available, that the fire never died completely, that everything needed for the birth was clean and ready. His quiet competence in these preparations revealed a depth of character that the accusations against him had obscured. Whatever had happened in his past, The man she had come to know bore little resemblance to the coward described in village gossip. One morning, as she worked slowly in the garden, planting seeds that Ralph Jackson had acquired through careful trading, Judith felt the first unmistakable signs that her time had come. The contractions were mild at first, allowing her to finish the row she was working on before making her way back to the cottage. Ralph Jackson took one look at her face and immediately began the preparations they had discussed. His movements efficient but calm. There was no panic in his manner, only the steady competence of someone accustomed to crisis. The labor progressed slowly through the morning and into the afternoon. Heather Lopez arrived when summoned, but her advanced age and shaking hands made Judith grateful for Ralph Jackson's presence. He remained nearby, but respectfully distant, ready to assist if needed, but careful not to intrude on what was primarily women's work. When complications arose and the midwife's uncertainty became apparent, he stepped forward without hesitation, his battlefield experience proving invaluable in a very different kind of emergency. The baby arrived as the sun was setting, a healthy son whose first cries filled the cottage with joy and relief. Judith held her child close, tears streaming down her face as she looked into eyes that reminded her so strongly of Nicholas. Ralph Jackson stood quietly in the doorway, his own eyes bright with emotion as he witnessed this miracle of new life. When Heather Lopez departed with promises to check on them the next day, he helped Judith settle comfortably with her son, ensuring that both mother and child had everything they needed. "He's beautiful," Ralph Jackson said softly, his voice filled with wonder. "What will you call him?" Judith looked down at her son, considering names she and Nicholas had discussed during happier times. But as she watched the baby's tiny fingers curl around hers, a different name came to her lips, one that honored not just the past, but the present as well. "Carl," she said finally. "His name is Carl." The choice surprised her even as she spoke it, but it felt right in a way she could not fully explain. Nicholas had been the baby's father, but Ralph Jackson had been present for his birth, had helped bring him safely into the world when others might have failed. The name honored both the man who had given the child life and the one who had helped preserve it. Ralph Jackson's eyes widened slightly at her choice, understanding immediately the significance of her decision. He had shared his own given name with her during one of their evening conversations, though he rarely used it now, preferring to be addressed simply as Jackson. To hear it spoken as her son's name was a gift he had not expected. Recognition of his place in their small family story, the weeks that followed were among the happiest Judith had known since Nicholas's death. Little Carl proved to be a content baby, sleeping well and feeding eagerly. Ralph Jackson continued his work around the homestead while also helping with the countless tasks that caring for an infant required. He proved surprisingly gentle with the child, his large hands careful and sure when holding the baby or helping with his care. Watching him interact with her son, Judith began to see glimpses of the man he had been before disgrace and exile had hardened his heart. As summer progressed, their small household found a peaceful rhythm that felt almost like a real family. Ralph Jackson had completed most of the major repairs and improvements to the property, transforming it from a struggling widow's cottage into a thriving small farm. The expanded garden provided more than enough food for their needs, with surplus to trade for other necessities. Little Carl grew strong and healthy under the care of two devoted adults, his laughter bringing light to even the darkest days. But peace was not destined to last in a kingdom still torn by conflict and political intrigue. Word came that the war had resumed with renewed ferocity, and with it came demands for increased taxes and levies to support the military effort. Lord Ethan Roberts announced that all households would be subject to new assessments, with particular attention paid to any unusual arrangements or sources of income. The implication was clear. Judith's purchase of Ralph Jackson's service had been noted, and questions were being asked about the propriety of their arrangement. The first official visit came on a warm July morning when Carl was sleeping peacefully in his cradle. Cynthia Martinez, the Lord's representative for such matters, arrived with two guards in an air of officious importance. She examined the improvements to the property with calculating eyes, noting the new roof, the expanded garden, and the general prosperity that had replaced the desperate poverty of winter. Her questions were pointed and intrusive, designed to uncover any irregularities that might justify increased taxation or other penalties. "This is quite an improvement from your circumstances last winter," Cynthia observed, her tone suggesting suspicion rather than congratulation. One might wonder how a widow with no income managed such extensive renovations. Judith kept her voice steady as she replied, I purchased a term of service at legal auction. The improvements are the result of that investment. Indeed, Cynthia continued, her eyes moving to where Ralph Jackson stood quietly near the garden. And what exactly is the nature of this service arrangement? It seems quite comprehensive. The questions continued for nearly an hour, each one designed to find fault or impropriety in their living situation. Ralph Jackson answered when directly addressed, his responses brief and respectful, but offering no more information than absolutely necessary. Judith found herself growing angry at the intrusion, at the implication that their practical arrangement was somehow shameful or illegal. When Cynthia finally departed with her guards, she left behind an atmosphere of unease that lingered like smoke from a dying fire. The message was clear. They were being watched, judged, and found wanting by those who preferred their social order neat and predictable. A disgraced knight and a pregnant widow had dared to find stability and happiness together, and such audacity would not go unchallenged. That evening, as they sat by the fire with little Carl sleeping between them, Ralph Jackson broke the silence that had stretched since the official's departure. They'll be back, he said quietly. This was just the beginning. Judith nodded, having reached the same conclusion. What do you think they want? To find an excuse to separate us, he replied, his voice heavy with certainty. My presence here challenges their narrative about disgrace and redemption. They can't allow a disgraced knight to find peace and purpose, especially not in the company of a respectable woman. The truth of his words settled over them like a cold wind. Their happiness had been built on shaky foundations, dependent on the tolerance of those who had already shown themselves capable of great cruelty. But Judith found that she was no longer the frightened, desperate woman who had stood at that auction block months ago. Motherhood had strengthened her, and Ralph Jackson's steady presence had taught her that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. Then we'll face whatever comes, she said firmly. Together. Ralph Jackson looked at her with something approaching admiration. You've changed, he observed. You're not the same woman who bought my service. Neither are you the same man who was sold, she replied. We've both found something worth fighting for. The challenges came sooner than expected. Within a week of Cynthia Martinez's visit, new accusations began circulating in the village. Someone claimed to have seen improper behavior between the widow and her servant. Others whispered about the baby's paternity, suggesting that the timing of his birth raised questions about his true father. The gossip was vicious and largely unfounded, but it served its purpose of undermining their reputation and isolating them from community support. The campaign against them escalated when Lord Ethan Roberts himself arrived at their cottage on a gray September morning. He came with a full retinue of guards and officials, their presence transforming the peaceful homestead into something resembling a military encampment. Judith held little Carl close as she watched the Lord dismount, his expression stern and unforgiving. This was no routine inspection, but a formal investigation, designed to find grounds for whatever action he had already decided to take. Ralph Jackson stood beside her, his bearing straight and proud despite the circumstances. Judith could see the effort it cost him to maintain his composure in the face of his former commander, the man who had once trusted him with important missions and now viewed him as a source of scandal and disorder. The weight of their shared history hung heavy in the air, unspoken accusations and denials swirling between them like autumn leaves caught in a bitter wind. Sir Ralph, Lord Roberts began, using the former title with deliberate irony. You were sold into service to provide labor, nothing more, yet reports suggest you have exceeded the bounds of that arrangement. I have fulfilled every obligation of my service contract, Ralph Jackson replied evenly. The work has been completed to the best of my ability. The work, perhaps, the Lord continued, his eyes moving to Judith and the baby. But what of your conduct? What of the appearance of impropriety that damages not only your own reputation, but that of this household? Judith felt anger rising in her chest like a tide of fire. These men who had never known hunger or desperation, who had never faced the choice between survival and social convention, dared to judge her for finding a way to protect herself and her child. Their comfortable certainties had never been tested by real hardship, yet they presumed to dictate how others should respond to crisis. "There has been no impropriety," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "We have lived according to the terms of a legal contract, nothing more." Lord Roberts turned his attention to her, his expression suggesting that he found her defense amusing rather than convincing. "Indeed, and yet the child bears a name that some find interesting. Carl, is it not? A curious choice for a woman honoring her deceased husband's memory." The implication hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. They were suggesting that Ralph Jackson was the baby's father, that their arrangement had been a cover for an illicit relationship that began before Nicholas's death. It was a cruel distortion of the truth, designed to destroy both their reputations while providing justification for whatever punishment Lord Roberts had in mind. "The child's name honors many things," Judith replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "including the kindness shown by those who helped bring him safely into this world." "Kindness," Lord Roberts repeated, tasting the word as if it were bitter medicine. "An interesting interpretation of duty. But duty has boundaries, Sir Ralph, as you should well remember. Your past failures suggest a troubling pattern of exceeding proper limits." The reference to Ralph Jackson's disgrace brought color to his cheeks, but he maintained his composure. Whatever had happened in his past, whatever choices had led to his downfall, he bore the weight of those memories with dignity that impressed even his accusers. Judith found herself wondering again about the true story behind his fall from grace, the details that had been lost in the rush to judgment and punishment. "My past mistakes do not invalidate my present service," Ralph Jackson said quietly. "I have worked honestly and lived honorably under this roof." "Honorably," Lord Roberts mused, his tone suggesting skepticism. "Yet honor requires more than mere compliance with contract terms. It requires recognition of one's place, acceptance of proper boundaries. You were sold as a laborer, yet you behave as if you were a member of this household." The accusation struck at the heart of their arrangement, challenging not just Ralph Jackson's conduct, but Judith's right to determine how her own household should function. She had purchased his service legally, had treated him with the respect due any human being, and had benefited from his skills and knowledge in rebuilding their small farm. That others found this arrangement threatening spoke more to their own insecurities than to any actual wrongdoing. "He is a member of this household," Judith declared, surprising herself with the firmness of her conviction. "He has earned his place through honest work and decent behavior. If that troubles you, the fault lies not with us, but with those who cannot recognize worth when it stands before them." The confrontation reached its climax when Lord Roberts produced a document bearing official seals and signatures. The paper trembled slightly in the morning breeze as he unfolded it, the formal language of legal authority lending weight to what was essentially an act of spite and social control. Judith felt her heart sink as she recognized the format of an official decree, the kind of document that could reshape lives with a few carefully chosen words. "By order of the Crown," Lord Roberts read aloud, his voice carrying the cold authority of absolute power. "The service contract between Judith Rogers and the former knight Ralph Jackson is hereby declared void due to irregularities in conduct in violation of social order. The subject, Ralph Jackson, is to be remanded to Crown custody for reassignment to more appropriate service." The words hit Judith like physical blows, each phrase driving home the reality that their peaceful life was about to be shattered by forces beyond their control. Little Carl stirred in her arms, perhaps sensing her distress, and she held him closer as if her embrace could shield him from the cruelty of the adult world. Ralph Jackson stood perfectly still, his face revealing nothing of the emotions that must be churning within him. "Furthermore," Lord Roberts continued, "the property improvements made during this irregular arrangement are declared forfeit to the Crown, as they were accomplished through improper use of contracted labor. The widow Rogers will be relocated to more suitable accommodations where proper supervision can be maintained." The decree was comprehensive in its cruelty, designed not just to separate them but to destroy everything they had built together. The cottage that had become a home, the garden that promised food security, the small farm that represented hope for the future, all would be stripped away as if their months of hard work had never happened. It was punishment disguised as moral correction, vengeance wrapped in the language of social propriety. Judith found her voice despite the shock that threatened to overwhelm her. "This is unjust," she said, her words carrying across the courtyard with surprising strength. "We have broken no laws, violated no true moral principles. Our only crime was finding a way to survive and prosper despite the hardships you and others like you have created." "Justice," Lord Roberts replied with a cold smile, "is not determined by those who benefit from disorder. You purchased a man's service, not his companionship. You contracted for labor, not for the pretense of family. The distinction matters, even if you choose to ignore it." Ralph Jackson stepped forward then, his movement drawing the attention of every guard in the courtyard. For a moment, Judith feared he might do something desperate, might challenge the Lord's authority in a way that would only make their situation worse. But when he spoke, his voice was calm and measured, carrying the dignity that no amount of disgrace could fully destroy. "My lord," he said formally, acknowledging their past relationship while maintaining his current position, "if my presence here has caused scandal, then perhaps it would be best if I departed voluntarily. But I ask that you reconsider the punishment of this woman and her child. They have done nothing to deserve your displeasure except show kindness to one who had fallen from grace." The offer was noble and heartbreaking, a final attempt to protect those he had come to care about, even at the cost of his own welfare. Judith felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized what he was trying to do, how he was attempting to shoulder all the blame for their unconventional arrangement. It was the gesture of a true knight, the kind of selfless courage that his accusers claimed he lacked. But Lord Roberts was not interested in noble gestures or reasonable compromises. His purpose here was not justice but demonstration, a public reminder of what happened to those who challenged the established order. Ralph Jackson's offer only seemed to increase his determination to see the punishment through to its bitter conclusion. "Your voluntary departure would have been welcome months ago," the Lord replied coldly. "Now it is too late for such gestures. The damage to social order has been done, and it must be corrected through proper channels." The guards moved forward then, their intent clear despite the lack of direct orders. Ralph Jackson would be taken into custody, Judith would be relocated under supervision, and little Carl would grow up knowing nothing of the man who had helped bring him safely into the world. It was a tidy solution from the perspective of those in power, a restoration of proper hierarchy and social control. But as the guards approached, something unexpected happened. The villagers who had gathered to witness the spectacle began to murmur among themselves, their voices rising in a chorus of dissent that surprised everyone present. Martha Wright stepped forward from the crowd, her weathered face set in lines of determination that matched Judith's own. "This is wrong," she declared, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "These people have harmed no one, helped each other through hardship, and made something good from desperate circumstances. If that threatens your authority, perhaps the problem lies not with them, but with the system that would destroy such decency." The crowd's murmur grew into something more substantial as other voices joined Martha Wright's protest. Donna Young stepped forward, her own baby cradled in her arms, adding her voice to the growing chorus of dissent. Even some who had previously criticized Judith's arrangement now seemed moved by the obvious injustice of the situation. The sight of a mother and child being punished for finding a way to survive touched something deep in the community's collective conscience. "They've done nothing wrong," called out Carl Williams, the merchant who had once gossiped about their arrangement. "If working hard and caring for each other is a crime, then we're all guilty." Lord Roberts looked around the courtyard with growing alarm as more villagers stepped forward to voice their support. This was not the compliant acceptance he had expected, but rather the kind of popular uprising that threatened the very foundations of feudal authority. His guards shifted nervously, uncertain how to respond to civilian protests that were growing bolder by the moment. Ralph Jackson seemed as surprised as anyone by this unexpected show of support. The man who had been stripped of honor and cast out by his peers was now being defended by common folk who had once viewed him with suspicion. Their voices rose in a chorus of moral authority that carried more weight than any official decree, speaking truths that power preferred to ignore. Look at what they've accomplished, shouted Heather Lopez, the elderly midwife who had assisted at Carl's birth. A broken-down cottage transformed into a proper home, wasteland turned into productive garden, a widow and child given security and hope. If this is what comes from their arrangement, then perhaps we need more such arrangements, not fewer. The crowd's energy was building towards something that could easily spiral beyond anyone's control. Judith found herself at the center of a moment that would be remembered long after the immediate crisis passed, a turning point where ordinary people chose to stand against injustice despite the personal cost such defiance might bring. She looked around at the faces of neighbors and acquaintances who were risking their own security to defend her family and felt a surge of gratitude that threatened to overwhelm her completely. But it was Ralph Jackson who provided the moment's most powerful testimony. Stepping forward to address not just Lord Roberts, but the entire assembled crowd, he spoke with a clarity and passion that reminded everyone present why he had once been considered a knight worthy of trust and respect. "I came here as a broken man," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Stripped of everything I had once valued, convinced that I had forfeited any claim to honor or purpose. But this woman saw something in me that I could no longer see in myself. She offered not just employment, but the chance to rebuild, to contribute something meaningful to the world again. Under her roof, I found not just shelter, but the possibility of redemption." He paused, his eyes moving from face to face in the crowd before settling on Judith and little Carl. "I have served faithfully and lived honorably in this household. If that service has exceeded the narrow bounds of a labor contract, then I am guilty as charged. But I would rather be guilty of caring too much than innocent of caring too little." The power of his words seemed to transform the very air in the courtyard. Here was a man who had lost everything speaking about finding hope in the most unlikely circumstances, defending not just his own actions, but the right of all people to form the relationships that sustain them through life's hardships. His testimony cut through the legal technicalities and social conventions to reach the fundamental human truths that law and custom were supposed to serve. Lord Roberts found himself facing a situation that his authority had not prepared him to handle. The crowd's support for the accused was genuine and growing, their moral conviction challenging his legal authority in ways that could not be easily dismissed. To proceed with the planned punishment in the face of such opposition would risk creating martyrs and potentially sparking broader unrest. Yet to back down would undermine his authority and encourage future challenges to established order. The standoff stretched for long minutes, tension building like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Judith held her breath as she watched the Lord's face, trying to read the calculations taking place behind his cold eyes. The guards remained ready for action, but their earlier confidence had been shaken by the crowd's unexpected solidarity. Even they seemed to recognize that enforcing an unpopular decree against peaceful protesters would require a level of force that might prove difficult to justify. It was little Carl who broke the deadlock, his innocent laughter ringing out across the courtyard as he reached toward Ralph Jackson with tiny grasping fingers. The baby's joy in seeing the man who had helped care for him since birth provided a moment of pure humanity that cut through all the political posturing and legal maneuvering. Here was a child who knew nothing of social conventions or political calculations, responding only to the love and security he had found in his small family. The sight of the baby reaching for Ralph Jackson seemed to crystallize something in the crowd's collective consciousness. This was not about abstract principles of social order or legal technicalities, but about a family that had been formed through necessity and strengthened through mutual care. The child's innocent gesture spoke more powerfully than any argument about the bonds that had developed in their small household, relationships that transcended the formal boundaries of their original contract. Martha Wright stepped closer to Judith, offering silent support through her physical presence. Other women followed her example, creating a protective circle around mother and child that would be difficult for the guards to breach without appearing to threaten defenseless civilians. The men of the village positioned themselves more subtly, but no less meaningfully, their body language making clear that any violence against their neighbors would not go unopposed. Lord Roberts recognized the shift in momentum, the way public sentiment had turned decisively against his planned course of action. To proceed now would require him to order his guards to disperse a crowd of peaceful protesters defending a mother and child. an image that would spread throughout the kingdom and reflect poorly on his judgment and character. The political cost of such action might well exceed any benefit gained from enforcing social conformity, but he was not prepared to simply retreat without achieving some measure of his original objective. His authority had been challenged publicly, and some response was required to maintain the respect that effective governance demanded. The solution, when it came to him, was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. "Very well," he announced, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmur. "It appears that this community has chosen to embrace this irregular arrangement. If that is your collective will, then you may bear the collective responsibility for its consequences." The words carried an ominous undertone that made Judith's stomach tighten with apprehension. Lord Roberts was not conceding defeat, but rather changing the terms of engagement, finding a way to punish the entire community for their defiance of his authority. His next words confirmed her fears and introduced a new dimension to their crisis. Effective immediately, this village's tax assessment is doubled to reflect the additional prosperity that such arrangements apparently generate. Furthermore, the military levy for the resumed war effort will be increased proportionally, with special attention paid to households that have benefited from irregular labor contracts. The collective gasp that rose from the crowd spoke to the devastating impact of this pronouncement. Doubling the tax burden would bankrupt many families, while increased military levies meant more sons and husbands would be conscripted for a war that had already claimed too many lives. Lord Roberts had found a way to make the entire community pay for their support of Judith and Ralph Jackson, turning their solidarity into a weapon against them. Unless, of course, the Lord continued with cold satisfaction, the irregularities that prompted this investigation are corrected voluntarily. The choice is yours to make. The ultimatum was clear and cruel in its effectiveness. The villagers could continue to support Judith's household and face financial ruin, or they could abandon their principles to protect their own families. It was a masterful piece of political manipulation, using economic pressure to achieve what direct force could not accomplish. Lord Roberts had turned the community's moral strength into a vulnerability that he could exploit. Judith felt the crowd's energy shift as the implications of the Lord's threat became clear. Faces that had moments before shown determination now revealed uncertainty and fear. These were people with their own families to protect, their own struggles to survive. Asking them to sacrifice their children's welfare for the sake of abstract principles was a burden that no one had the right to impose. "No," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet courtyard. "I won't allow an entire community to suffer for my choices." She stepped forward, still holding little Carl, her decision crystallizing with painful clarity. The crowd had shown her more support than she had any right to expect, but she could not ask them to pay such a devastating price for their kindness. Some sacrifices were too great to accept, even when offered freely by those who cared. "If my arrangement with Ralph Jackson must end to protect these people, then so be it," she continued, her voice steady despite the breaking of her heart. "But I ask that you allow us time to make proper arrangements for the transition. A few days to ensure that the baby's needs are met and that the property can be properly transferred." Lord Roberts studied her face, perhaps surprised by her willingness to surrender when victory had seemed within reach. But he was a practical man who recognized when his objectives had been achieved, and he saw no benefit in appearing unnecessarily harsh when his opponent had chosen to capitulate. "3 days," he agreed curtly. "After that, the former knight reports to the garrison for reassignment, and you relocate to quarters where proper supervision can be maintained." The decree was final, its terms non-negotiable. Ralph Jackson would be torn from the life he had rebuilt and sent to some distant posting where his skills could be exploited without the complications of personal attachment. Judith would be moved to some form of supervised housing where her every action could be monitored and controlled. Little Carl would grow up never knowing the man who had helped shape his earliest months, deprived of the father figure who had emerged from the most unlikely circumstances. The 3 days that followed were among the most bittersweet of Judith's life. She and Ralph Jackson worked together to complete the final tasks around the homestead, their movements carrying the weight of impending separation. Every shared meal felt precious, every conversation treasured against the long silence that would follow his departure. Little Carl seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, becoming fussier and more demanding of attention, as if trying to hold on to the security he had always known. The villagers came by in small groups throughout those final days, bringing food and small gifts while offering awkward apologies for their inability to maintain their support in the face of Lord Roberts's economic threats. Judith assured each visitor that she understood their position, that she harbored no resentment for their practical choices. Family obligations had to take precedence over abstract principles, and she would not judge anyone for protecting their own children's welfare. On the final evening, as they sat by the fire with little Carl sleeping between them, Ralph Jackson broke the silence that had stretched through most of the day. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that these months have been the happiest of my adult life. Whatever happens next, I will carry the memory of this time as proof that redemption is possible, that people can find their way back from even the deepest disgrace." Judith felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked at this man who had become so much more than a purchased servant. He had been friend, protector, and partner in the truest sense, helping her transform from a desperate widow into a confident woman capable of facing whatever challenges lay ahead. Their relationship had transcended the boundaries of their original contract to become something rare and precious, a connection forged in hardship and strengthened through mutual respect. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "When I bought your service, I thought I was purchasing labor. Instead, I found family." They held each other then, an embrace that spoke of love in all its forms, the complex mixture of gratitude, affection, and deep caring that had grown between them over months of shared struggle and triumph. It was not the romantic love of poetry and song, but something perhaps more valuable, the love of souls who had found in each other the strength to survive and grow. The morning of departure arrived gray and cold, autumn's chill promising the harsh winter ahead. Ralph Jackson gathered his few possessions, while Judith prepared little Carl for the journey to their new quarters. The cottage that had been transformed from a desperate refuge into a warm home would soon house strangers who would never know the love and hope that had filled its rooms. The garden they had planted together would feed other mouths. The improvements they had made would benefit other lives. As the guards arrived to escort Ralph Jackson to his new assignment, the entire village gathered to witness their farewell. The same people who had supported them at the confrontation now stood silently, their faces reflecting the complex emotions of those who had been forced to choose between principle and survival. There was shame there, but also understanding, the recognition that sometimes good people are forced to make impossible choices. Ralph Jackson kissed little Carl's forehead gently, whispering words that only the baby could hear. Then he turned to Judith, his eyes bright with unshed tears, but his voice steady with the dignity that had carried him through every trial. "Take care of our boy," he said simply, the possessive pronoun acknowledging the family bond that no legal decree could truly sever. "Tell him when he's old enough to understand that his father loved him enough to let him go." The words hit Judith like a physical blow. Their truth and beauty and heartbreak all tangled together in a moment that would be seared into her memory forever. Ralph Jackson had claimed Carl as his son, not through blood, but through love, through the care and protection he had provided from the moment of the child's birth. In doing so, he had given the boy something more valuable than any inheritance, the knowledge that he was wanted and cherished by someone who had chosen to love him. As Ralph Jackson walked away between his guards, his back straight and his head held high, the villagers began to weep. Their tears fell not just for the injustice of his fate, but for their own failure to prevent it, for the cruel choices that power imposed on ordinary people trying to live decent lives. The story of the pregnant woman who had bought a beaten knight and found family would spread from village to village, becoming a tale of love and loss that would move listeners to tears for generations to come. But even as one chapter ended in heartbreak, another was beginning in hope. Judith held her son close as she watched the man who had become his father disappear into the distance, and she whispered a promise that would guide all her future choices. Carl would grow up knowing that he was loved, that he came from people who chose courage over comfort, who built family from the broken pieces of their lives. And someday when the kingdom's political winds shifted as they always did, Perhaps there would be a chance for reunion, for the restoration of the bonds that no decree could truly break. The kingdom wept for their story, but it also remembered. And in that memory lay the seeds of hope that would someday bloom into justice, when love would finally triumph over the petty cruelties of those who mistook power for righteousness.